Hello and welcome to this fourth podcast in the series about alcoholism. This week we will be discussing the question of dual diagnosis that many alcoholics suffer with as well as their alcoholism. Good morning, Andy.
Good morning, George. How are you?
Welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
What is dual diagnosis?
Dual diagnosis very simply means an alcoholic that has a problem with alcohol and is diagnosed as an alcoholic but also has a coexisting mental health issue.
Okay, so the person has alcoholism and suffer from a mental illness as well.
Not everybody that comes to AA suffers from mental health issues, but a lot do. So there are alcoholics that come into AA that have an underlying mental illness on top of their alcoholism.
Can you elaborate what type of illness is it depression or?
Well, it can be anything. These days, you see a lot of people coming into AA with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, schizoaffective psychosis, the classic mental illnesses. But there's also a lot of alcoholics that come into AA that suffer from severe and enduring depression and anxiety, which make it very difficult for them to stay sober.
How is dual diagnosis viewed in Alcoholics Anonymous?
I think that the classic mental illness that some people present with when they come to AA is more or less accepted in AA, and these people are just left to get on with their sobriety. There's quite a different view regarding depression and anxiety. This is viewed quite differently in AA, and there are very many conflicting opinions on how to treat depression and anxiety in AA.
Okay. So how is this dual diagnosis viewed in AA broadly?
Well, there is actually an official AA conference approved pamphlet which is entitled The AA Member, Medication and Other Drugs. It was published in 2018 originally, and it discusses the use of certain medications for alcoholics in sobriety that may help to treat their coexisting mental health issues. And I thought that it would be interesting if I just read a little bit of it so that the listener can understand what the official AA position is about the use of medications to treat coexisting mental health issues.
Yeah, please go on.
Introduction to the pamphlet. Because this subject involves important medical decisions, a group of physicians who are members of AA and two physicians who are friends of AA were asked to review this pamphlet. Some AA members must take prescribed medication for serious medical problems. However, it is generally accepted that the misuse of prescribed medication and other drugs can threaten the achievement and maintenance of sobriety. It may be possible to minimize the threat of relapse if the following suggestions are heeded. The first and most important suggestion is that no AA member should play doctor. All medical advice and treatment should come from a qualified physician. The pamphlet then goes on to say that some alcoholics require medication. This is also a very interesting read. We recognize that alcoholics are not immune to other diseases. Some of us have had to cope with depressions that can be suicidal, schizophrenia that sometimes requires hospitalization, bipolar disorder, and other mental and biological illnesses. Also among us are diabetics, epileptics, members with heart trouble, cancer, allergies, hypertension, and many other serious physical conditions. Because of the difficulties that many alcoholics have with drugs, some members have taken the position that no one in AA should take any medication. While this position has undoubtedly prevented relapse for some, it has meant disaster for others. AA members and many of their physicians have described situations in which depressed patients have been told by AAs to throw away the pills, only to have depression return with all its difficulties, sometimes resulting in suicide. We have heard too from members with other conditions including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, epilepsy, and others requiring medication that well-meaning AA friends discourage them from taking any prescribed medication. Unfortunately, by following a layperson's advice, the sufferers find that their conditions can return with all their previous intensity. On top of that, they feel guilty because they are convinced that AA is against pills. It becomes clear that just as it is wrong to enable or support any alcoholic to become re-addicted to any drug, it's equally wrong to deprive any alcoholic of medication which can alleviate or control other disabling physical and or emotional problems. Some AA members who have required medication share their experience, and then the rest of the pamphlet goes on to describe personal stories of people that have been required to take medication in sobriety, but I won't go into those now. But that is the AA conference-approved pamphlet published in 2018 entitled The AA Member, Medication and Other Drugs.
Okay, so we are at alcoholism and dual diagnosis. And what's the attitude amongst AA members about the use of medication? Not what's written in the books and in the information, but the members.
There's nothing really written in the AA literature about the use of medication. There is some casual references that Bill writes in the big book that members should take their problems to psychologists if they have problems that won't respond to treatment with the 12 steps. But on the whole, the general attitude of AA over the years has become much more tolerant than, say, in the 60s and 70s, where there was quite a strong, at least in the London Fellowship, where I got sober, there was some very conflicted and diverse attitudes about the use of any type of medication in sobriety.
And that somehow answers my next question. What is AA's official position on the use of medication that improves mental health for alcoholics in recovery? And what does the AA literature say, as you mentioned briefly?
Well, I've just read the AA conference-approved pamphlet. That should explain AA's official position. The issue is about the different and diverse attitudes and opinions of AA members in dealing with the problem of the use of medications in sobriety.
Do the 12 steps work to treat mental health issues that often coexist with alcoholism? The 12 steps, the step work.
I can only speak personally. For me, I needed to take medication in my early days to help me to get well enough to do the 12 steps. And the 12 steps really transformed my life and gave me a much happier experience of life. And so I can say that the 12 steps enabled me eventually to come off my medication.
Some sponsors, as you told me previously here, let go of new sponsees when they think that the sponsee are just substituting alcohol with medication and can't be considered sober. What's your thoughts about this?
Well, this is a really bad mistake for a sponsor to fire a sponsee because they're on medication that is prescribed for them by a physician. It's not really the role of a sponsor to fire a sponsee. If the sponsor doesn't feel comfortable sponsoring someone who is on medication, then they should politely decline sponsorship and refer them to another sponsor in AA or someone else in AA that will sponsor them whilst they're on medication.
Do you think it's possible to recover from the mental, physical and spiritual illness of alcoholism as described in the big book by applying these 12 steps?
The 12 steps have gone a long, long way in not only treating the threefold illness, mental, physical and spiritual, but they've gone a long way in helping me to recover from the coexisting mental health issues that I had in early sobriety. I suffered very badly from depression and from severe anxiety and panic attacks in early recovery, and I needed medication to help me to cope.
The founder of AA, Bill Wilson, did he suffer from any mental health issues in recovery?
Yes. Bill Wilson suffered very badly with poor emotional health when he first got sober. He even wrote an article which was published in the well-known book As Bill Sees It. So on page 285, Bill writes, "In my early years of sobriety, I was full of pride, thinking that AA was the only source of treatment for a good and happy life. It certainly was the basic ingredient for my sobriety, and even today, with over 12 years in the program, I am very involved in meetings, sponsorship and service. During the first 4 years of my recovery, I found it necessary to seek professional help since my emotional health was extremely poor. There are those folks too who have found sobriety and happiness in other organizations. AA taught me that I had a choice to go to any lengths to enhance my sobriety. AA may not be a cure-all for everything, but it is the center of my sober living."
Okay. Did Bill Wilson receive any outside treatment for his poor emotional health and depression?
In fact, he did. In those days, there were still no antidepressants on the market, and so Bill saw alternate treatments to treat his depression.
Like what?
Well, he even used LSD, believe it or not, under medical supervision to try and resolve his issues with depression, and he actually spoke quite highly of the benefits of the use of LSD for his depression. And he also went through a phase where he found something called vitamin B3 niacin therapy, and in 1960 he spoke very highly of this method of treatment using vitamin B3 or niacin therapy that helped him apparently with his depression as well.
What's your own experience with dual diagnosis when you first got sober?
I was very unwell when I first got sober in AA. I undoubtedly suffered from coexisting mental health issues. I was barely able to function when I first put down the alcohol. Alcohol had been my crutch since I was 13 years old, and when I put down the alcohol, I actually wasn't able to function very well in society. The only thing that I was capable of doing was going to meetings, and even going to meetings was quite traumatic in my very early days of sobriety. So I realized that there must be something more wrong with me than just alcohol, and I went and I received professional intervention from a psychiatrist who prescribed antidepressant medication.
You are now recovered from the mental health issues that you suffer from when you first got sober, or?
Yes, I don't think that I suffer from the same mental health issues that I did when I first got sober. That being said, I do believe that alcoholism is in itself a subtle mental illness, which means that if we don't treat our thought-disordered alcoholic minds with the program and with the 12 steps, our attitudes become progressively more negative and arrogant and self-willed and dishonest. And we need the program. I need the program to help me with my alcoholic thinking.
Have you now recovered from what in the big book of AA Bill Wilson describes as the spiritual malady?
Well, I don't think that I will ever recover completely. I am recovering, provided I work a daily program of action, which for me means being committed to a spiritual way of life. So as long as I live that way, and a spiritual way of life basically means for me, as an agnostic member of AA, means to maintain honesty, open-mindedness and willingness, which means that I remain teachable to the principles of AA, and I try to practice love and service to other alcoholics. When I do this, I am treating the spiritual aspect of my illness.
So what would you say to a newcomer who feels like they are suffering from any type of mental health issues to make it difficult for them to stay sober and go to meetings and function in the world?
I would ask them if they've had anybody in AA, first of all, tell them to stop taking medication. And if that's the case, if they have been told or it's been suggested them to stop taking their medication, I tell them to not listen to that advice and to go to a doctor and get a professional assessment and diagnosis and treatment from a qualified physician.
Okay. So this is the fourth podcast in the series about alcoholism. Andy, you are writing a book.
I'm writing a book. It's called The 12 Steps for Agnostics, and it's my experiences of working the steps in AA without a belief in the traditional idea of God.
So how can you do AA without a belief in God?
Well, very simply, as I explain in my book, I found many different, very practical and positive higher powers in AA that have helped to resolve my alcoholism. I was told by a sponsor in my early days that I could make AA itself my higher power, and that has proved to be a very valuable piece of advice. So AA itself, the program, the suggestions of a sponsor, an ongoing relationship with my sponsor are all practical powers greater than me that help to maintain my sobriety.
So your book will be ready at the end of this year. How do we get hold of it? Can we go to your website?
You can go to my website, which is aaforagnostics.com. The book will be published on Amazon, hopefully towards the end of the year, and I encourage you to buy a copy. You may find some very helpful guidance, and it may be a useful resource for your sobriety if you identify as an agnostic or even an atheist in AA.
So on the web, aaforagnostics.com, and on Facebook, AA for Agnostics.
Correct.
Thanks a lot, Andy, for coming to the studio this morning.
Thank you very much, George.